Hello everybody and welcome to another Alfred Hitchcock Presents review. Today it is Season 1, Episode 11, Guilty Witness, starring Judith Evelyn as Amelia Verburg, Joe Mantell as Stanley Crane, and Kathleen Maguire as Dorothy Crane. And this is a solid episode, if a little bit on the repetitive side. And the episode has a good twist that works pretty well. There are some subtle clues given throughout the episode. The ending feels a little bit rushed and a little bit abrupt, but it works pretty well for the most part, and it does a pretty good job of misleading the audience. So we start with one of our main characters, Stanley, and he runs a store, and he's talking with some customers outside, including a Mr. Verburg, which would be significant. And then Mrs. Verburg comes in, and she's got a bruise on her face, but she says, "Think nothing of it, I just tripped and fell." But then Stanley's wife, Dorothy, our other main character, comes in, and she thinks there's more to it. She thinks that Mrs. Verburg has been hit, and she just feels like the Verburgs are having some problems overall. So her and her husband talk about this, and you can definitely tell that Dorothy is much more concerned about it than Stanley is, which we'll find out makes sense by the end of the episode. So at this point, we go to the next scene, and there's a phone call, and Stanley takes it, and it's for Mr. Verburg, and it's notable that it seems like there's only one phone for everyone that lives in this building in the different rooms, which is interesting. So at this point, Stanley also runs into a baby Buggy, which is Mrs. Verburg's, which is significant. And after that, he basically goes home, and there's a lot of noise coming from the Verburg place, and it seems like a pretty bad fight, and Dorothy's really worried. She says, maybe we should do something, and Stanley says, it's not our problem, we shouldn't get involved, it'll take care of itself. And all of a sudden, it gets really quiet upstairs, so it seems like Stanley was right. So we go to scene the next day, I think it's the next day, and Mrs. Verburg comes in, and she says she needs a box to put her children's toys in. So Stanley brings the box to her apartment on his break, which was a pretty nice thing to do, I have to say, and he gets another call at this point, and we find out that Mr. Verburg is missing. So now Dorothy is back to being very concerned again, but Stanley really still isn't that concerned, and they just talk about the box that he brought Mrs. Verburg, and pretty much Dorothy just seems to be a little bit too worried about this. So we go to the next scene, and a health inspector comes, and he says he has to inspect the apartment, and he's talking to Mr. Verburg, and eventually Mr. Verburg thinks that this guy's asking some strange questions. So the man reveals he's really a detective from homicide, and he says he's investigating a call from an unknown source that Mrs. Verburg killed her husband, but he couldn't really find anything. He's trying to figure out how. So Stanley remembers the carton that he brought to Mrs. Verburg, and they think that maybe she did something with the body or did something like that. So we go to the next scene where the detective and Stanley go into the Verburg apartment, and they do find the carton, but there really are only toys in it, so that was a pretty good mislead for us, the audience. So then we get another talk between Dorothy and Stanley. They're getting ready to eat dinner, and they're debating what happened to Mr. Verburg, and eventually Stanley gets mad. He says enough is enough. He doesn't really understand why Dorothy's so obsessed with this, but Dorothy just keeps insisting that something bad happened to Mr. Verburg, that his wife killed him, and I have to say Dorothy's getting just a little annoying at this point, but it makes sense when we find out what happens at the end of the episode. So at this point, Mrs. Verburg comes back in the store, and she gives Stanley this story about how her husband is away, but the story really doesn't match up with what we already know. So Stanley's very concerned right now, and he calls the detective back, and he tells the detective something about this lady's story just isn't right. So they come up with this theory that, Mrs. Verburg probably couldn't have taken the body out of the building, but maybe she took it down to the basement because people really don't go down there. Now, didn't they think of this sooner? I'm just saying there was a basement and nobody checked it. That seemed a little bit odd, but they take this elevator down to the basement and they look around, and eventually Dorothy comes down as well, and at this point she's really becoming kind of a nuisance, to be honest. And eventually Stanley finds the baby Buggy, which he runs into again, and it turns out Mr. Verburg's body really is in it. So this was pretty good. It seemed like during the episode maybe the mislead was going to be that Mr. Verburg really wasn't killed by his wife. Maybe there was another explanation, but it turns out that Mrs. Verburg comes down and she admits that she did kill her husband at this point, but the reason is because he was going to leave her with another woman, and he wasn't even going to take care of their children or anything. He was just concerned about this lady, and basically she blames Dorothy because it turns out that Dorothy was the woman that Mr. Verburg was going to leave with. So a solid twist ending, if a little bit abrupt, but it does now kind of make sense why Dorothy was so concerned and why she knew so much kind of about what was really going on. So it turns out that she is the other woman, and we get a look on Stanley's face, and he's pretty surprised and he doesn't seem too happy. And also Mrs. Verburg attacks Dorothy at this point. So there's not really a happy ending for Mrs. Verburg, Dorothy, or Stanley in this episode. And this is just a solid episode overall, and I give Guilty Witness a 3 out of 5. Definitely an episode to check out at least once. So a 3 out of 5 for Guilty Witness, and as always, thank you very much for watching.